What if the life you believed was perfect, filled with luxury, power, and admiration, collapsed in a single night? Imagine standing beneath glittering chandeliers, surrounded by the wealthiest and most influential faces of New York, when the truth you never expected is revealed. A scandal powerful enough to shatter reputations, ruin fortunes, and expose lies hidden beneath layers of glamour. This is the story of Olivia Morgan, a woman who spent years living in the shadow of her husband's success. A woman admired, envied, but never truly seen. On the night her world should have been at its brightest, it fell into darkness. But sometimes in the ruins of humiliation, the seeds of transformation are born. Stay with me until the end, because this is not just a story about downfall, it is a story about rebirth, courage, and the moment when shame turns into strength. Olivia Morgan's life looked perfect from the outside. She lived in a penthouse overlooking Central Park, attended galas draped in designer gowns, and was photographed beside her husband at charity events and business dinners. To New York's elite, she was elegance personified, a woman who had everything: wealth, influence, and beauty. Yet behind the carefully polished image, Olivia often wondered if she truly belonged in the glittering world that adored her. Daniel Morgan, her husband, was the man everyone admired. A charismatic investor, his name commanded respect in boardrooms and headlines alike. He was ambitious, powerful, and skilled at presenting himself as the embodiment of success. Olivia often stood silently beside him at events, smiling on cue, applauding at speeches, and embodying the role of the supportive wife. To the world, they were untouchable, a couple that symbolized the height of success. But Olivia carried doubts no one else saw. She had built her own small business before Daniel's empire overshadowed everything. Slowly, she stopped being introduced as Olivia and became known only as Daniel's wife. Though she tried to ignore it, the identity she once held dear began to dissolve under the weight of his fame. Each photograph, each headline was another reminder that her individuality had been swallowed whole. Her days were filled with luncheons, fashion fittings, and social obligations that rarely brought her joy. Friends, if they could be called that, surrounded her for status rather than sincerity. Conversations revolved around wealth, vacations, and investments, leaving Olivia longing for something deeper. She often thought of her childhood, far from the glittering lights where life had been modest but filled with authenticity. That world felt like a distant memory now. At night, she sometimes stood by the window of their penthouse, looking out at the endless city lights. She asked herself if she was truly happy, or if she was simply playing a part in a performance too grand to stop. Daniel reassured her whenever she voiced doubts, but his words carried the coldness of someone more focused on reputation than on love. Olivia felt her voice slipping further away. Still, she stayed. She convinced herself that loyalty was her duty, that her life of glamour was worth the emptiness she felt inside. What she did not know was that the very world she clung to for stability was about to collapse in the most public and humiliating way possible. Olivia had mastered the art of silence. At galas, she smiled as Daniel boasted of new ventures. At dinners, she nodded politely while others praised his genius. She had learned how to occupy space without being noticed, to exist in the margins of her husband's spotlight. Silence had become her shield, protecting her from judgment, but it also imprisoned her in invisibility. She remembered her early years when she had been ambitious and independent. She once dreamed of running her own company, of creating something meaningful. But with Daniel's rise, her ambitions were pushed aside, replaced by his grand plans and his demand for control. He assured her she was important, but only as long as she stood quietly behind him, smiling for the cameras. Her independence faded like a photograph left in the sun. Though she rarely admitted it aloud, Olivia resented the role she had accepted. At times, she longed to speak her mind, to be more than an accessory in Daniel's carefully crafted image. She watched other women at events, executives, artists, leaders, and wondered if she could have been like them had she not given up her own dreams. The thought was painful, so she buried it deep. Daniel treated her with courtesy in public, but in private, his words often carried sharp edges. He dismissed her concerns, laughed at her suggestions, and reminded her that she was lucky to live the life she had. Olivia tried to believe him, but the truth gnawed at her. Luck without respect felt more like a gilded cage than a blessing. Still, Olivia endured. She told herself her sacrifices were for the sake of love, stability, and their shared image. But love had grown colder. Stability had become fear of scandal, and the image was all that remained. She wore silence like an evening gown, elegant on the outside, suffocating within. What Olivia didn't know was that silence would soon no longer be an option. The next event on their calendar promised to be Daniel's greatest triumph, a night of celebration before the city's elite. But for Olivia, it would become the moment when everything broke apart, and when her silence would finally give way to a voice she didn't know she had. The invitation was printed on thick ivory paper, sealed with gold embossing, and delivered in a velvet envelope. It announced a night of grandeur. Daniel Morgan's recognition as one of New York's most influential investors. The event would take place at the Astoria Grand, a ballroom famous for hosting royalty, politicians, and the most powerful figures in the country. For Daniel, it was not just an event, it was a coronation. Olivia moved through the penthouse that afternoon, overseeing the final details of their preparations. Designers arrived with racks of dresses, jewelers brought cases filled with diamonds, and makeup artists hovered with brushes ready to perfect her image. Every detail was chosen to reinforce their status. From the gown she would wear to the shoes Daniel insisted matched the color of his tie. It was all part of the performance. As assistants fluttered around her, Olivia felt strangely detached. The gowns shimmered under the light, but none of them felt like hers. Each jewel, each heel, felt borrowed, as though she were dressing for a role she no longer recognized. She smiled politely, nodded when asked, but inside she longed for the simplicity of being herself, not the character her husband demanded. Daniel, meanwhile, rehearsed his speech in the mirror, his words dripping with pride and ambition. He envisioned applause, reporters' flashes, and the praise of men who envied his wealth. Olivia watched from a distance, noticing how easily he spoke about power and profit, and how rarely he mentioned family or integrity. It was in those moments that she realized just how far apart their worlds had grown. Friends called to remind them they would be in attendance, voices brimming with excitement. Olivia responded with practiced warmth, but each call reminded her that her value in these circles existed only through Daniel. Without him, she wondered, who would she be? She tucked the thought away, afraid of the answer, and prepared herself to play the part once again. As the hour of the gala drew near, Olivia stared at her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at her wore diamonds, silk, and confidence, yet in her eyes she saw doubt, fear, and exhaustion. She whispered quietly to herself, "Just one more night." She did not yet know this night would change her life forever. The Astoria Grand glowed like a palace. Chandeliers spilled golden light across marble floors, and the air was heavy with the scent of roses imported from Italy. The city's elite arrived in chauffeured cars, stepping onto red carpets while photographers snapped pictures that would flood the society pages the next morning. The night sparkled with wealth, vanity, and ambition. Daniel entered like royalty, Olivia at his side, her hand resting delicately on his arm. Cameras flashed, capturing their perfect smiles as they walked into the ballroom. To outsiders, they seemed the epitome of power and grace. Daniel thrived in the spotlight, shaking hands, laughing loudly, and receiving admiration from every corner of the room. Olivia remained poised, her smile hiding the unease tightening in her chest. Inside the ballroom, tables glittered with crystal glasses and silver cutlery. Waiters moved swiftly with trays of champagne, while the orchestra played softly in the background. Guests mingled, voices buzzing with gossip and anticipation. This was Daniel's night, and he knew it. Every detail of the evening had been designed to elevate his reputation to heights never reached before. Olivia drifted from group to group, speaking politely but never lingering long. She felt like an ornament in the grand display, admired but never truly acknowledged. Her conversations were shallow, filled with empty compliments and questions that carried no meaning. She longed for authenticity, but in a room built on facades, truth had no place. As the evening progressed, speeches began. Business partners praised Daniel's brilliance. Journalists scribbled notes for tomorrow's headlines, and applause echoed through the room. Daniel smiled with pride, soaking in the glory he had carefully constructed. Olivia clapped too, her expression composed, but inside she wondered how long a world built on illusions could last. What neither Daniel nor Olivia realized was that beneath the golden chandeliers and polished marble, the night was preparing to unravel. Secrets had a way of surfacing, especially when pride grew too heavy to hide. And before the final toast was raised, the truth would shatter the very image they worked so hard to protect. The moment Daniel had been waiting for arrived. Standing at the podium beneath the massive chandelier, he delivered his speech with confidence and charm. He spoke of vision, of success, of the empire he had built. Applause filled the ballroom, cameras flashed, and pride radiated from his every gesture. Olivia stood beside him, smiling on cue, though her heart felt heavier than ever. Then, from the crowd, a voice cut through the applause. A journalist stood, holding documents in his hand. "Mr. Morgan," he said firmly, "how do you explain these records that link you to fraudulent accounts overseas?" The room fell silent. The orchestra froze, and all eyes turned toward Daniel. For a man who thrived on control, it was the first time his mask began to slip. Daniel laughed nervously, brushing it off as a misunderstanding. But the journalist pressed forward, presenting evidence, contracts, signatures, and bank transfers that painted a damning picture. Murmurs spread like wildfire across the tables. Guests who moments earlier had applauded now whispered with suspicion. Olivia felt her stomach twist as shame and disbelief crashed over her. The once celebratory night turned into a stage of humiliation. Cameras clicked rapidly, capturing Daniel's faltering smile and Olivia's pale expression. Investors exchanged uneasy glances, and politicians quietly slipped toward the exits. The golden glow of the ballroom now felt harsh, exposing every crack in the image Daniel had so carefully built. Olivia's hands trembled as she clutched her glass. The eyes of the crowd fell on her too, as though she carried the same guilt. She realized she was no longer just a silent wife at her husband's side. She was a witness to his downfall, dragged into the shame he had created. The world she thought was untouchable collapsed in seconds. And just like Olivia, you too are witnessing the turning point of a life built on appearances. If you don't want to miss stories like this, where truth bursts through the glitter and reveals what lies beneath, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Your support helps us continue sharing stories that remind us how fragile pride can be. The ballroom emptied in chaos, guests rushing to escape the scandal now unfolding. Reporters shouted questions. Flashes of cameras followed Daniel as he stormed off stage, his face twisted with fury. Olivia, frozen in place, felt as if the ground had been ripped from beneath her. The music had stopped, but the echoes of shame lingered in the silence. In the car ride home, Daniel raged, slamming his fist against the door and cursing the journalist who had ruined his night. He insisted it was all lies, a smear campaign, nothing more than jealousy. But Olivia could see it in his eyes. The fear, the guilt, the realization that the evidence was undeniable. His words no longer carried the weight they once had. At home, Olivia sat alone in the dark, still wearing the gown that had sparkled hours earlier. Now it felt heavy, suffocating, a reminder of the night her world shattered. She replayed every detail in her mind, the silence of the crowd, the humiliation in their stares, and the crushing realization that everything she believed in was built on deceit. Daniel paced the living room, muttering about lawyers and damage control. He still thought he could fix it, as if reputation were just another deal to negotiate. Olivia listened quietly, her heart sinking. For years she had silenced her doubts, endured his arrogance, and accepted his world. But tonight proved what she had always feared. His empire was not made of steel, but of sand. When he finally stormed into his office, slamming the door behind him, Olivia remained on the couch, staring at her reflection in the darkened window. For the first time in years, she felt completely alone, not just abandoned by society, but abandoned by the man she once trusted. Her silence no longer felt protective. It felt like chains she needed to break. The night had stripped away every illusion, and Olivia knew the days ahead would demand a choice: cling to the ruins of her husband's lies, or walk away and find a truth of her own. For the first time, the thought of leaving didn't terrify her. It gave her a glimmer of strength. The days following the gala were merciless. Headlines screamed Daniel's name, attaching words like fraud, corruption, and scandal beside it. Olivia's picture appeared too, her expression caught in the harsh light of the cameras, labeled as the wife who stood by him. In every coffee shop, office, and street corner, people whispered about the Morgans. The shame clung to her like a second skin she couldn't remove. Once admiring friends stopped calling. Invitations vanished overnight. Women who had once complimented her dresses now avoided her gaze at charity luncheons. Olivia felt eyes on her whenever she stepped outside, as if everyone believed she had been complicit in Daniel's deception. She had lost not only her social circle, but also her sense of safety. Inside their penthouse, tension grew unbearable. Daniel spent hours on the phone with lawyers, shouting at anyone who dared to question him. Olivia stayed in the background, her silence mistaken for agreement. But inside, she was drowning, suffocated by the weight of humiliation. Each day felt like a battle between loyalty to her marriage and the need to reclaim her dignity. Her business partners began withdrawing too. Small projects she had nurtured were canceled, her name tainted by association. She had worked for years to carve out her own path, but it seemed Daniel's scandal had swallowed everything she had built. The glamorous life that once made her feel important now mocked her with its emptiness. At night, she lay awake, unable to sleep. The words of strangers haunted her. She must have known. The accusation burned because part of her wondered if they were right. Had she been so eager to keep the image of perfection that she ignored the truth? The shame was not just Daniel's, it was hers too, until she found the courage to break free. The weight of shame pressed harder each day, but beneath it, a spark was beginning to glow. Olivia realized that she could no longer remain silent, nor could she continue living in the ruins of Daniel's lies. Something had to change, and she knew the choice would soon be hers alone. It happened late one evening. Daniel stormed into the living room, furious after another meeting with his lawyers. He ranted about betrayal, accusing investors and colleagues of abandoning him. Olivia listened quietly at first, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. But then, for the first time in years, she interrupted him. Her voice was steady, though her heart pounded. "Daniel, is it true?" The question silenced him. He froze, his eyes narrowing as if her words were an attack. "Of course not," he snapped. "You think I'd risk everything we built? This is jealousy, a witch hunt, and you, of all people, you should stand beside me." But Olivia didn't back down. She saw the flicker in his eyes, the hesitation that betrayed his guilt. For the first time, she realized the truth. He was lying. Her anger, long buried under silence, rose to the surface. "Stand beside you?" she said, her voice trembling with pain. "I've done nothing but stand beside you. I gave up my voice, my dreams, my identity to protect your image. And now you want me to protect your lies too?" Daniel tried to dismiss her words, but the fire in her eyes stopped him. For years, Olivia had been quiet, but in that moment, she found the courage to speak. She told him she would no longer sacrifice herself for his empire. She refused to be dragged deeper into his scandal, refused to be the silent wife shielding him from the consequences of his choices. The words shocked Daniel, who had never seen her so defiant. He tried to regain control, softening his tone, pleading with her. "Olivia, you can't leave me. Without you, I have nothing. They'll destroy me." But his desperation only revealed the truth she had ignored for too long. He had always needed her silence, not her love. His empire had been built not only on fraud, but on her complicity. That night, Olivia made a decision that shook the walls of the penthouse. She would no longer stay chained to Daniel's lies. For the first time in years, she felt the weight lift from her chest. Shame no longer defined her. Courage was beginning to take its place. The morning after their confrontation, Olivia packed a small suitcase. She did not take jewels or gowns, only a few clothes and personal items that reminded her of who she once was. The silence of the penthouse weighed heavy as she zipped the bag. For years, she had lived there as if it were a palace. Now, it felt like a prison she was finally leaving behind. Daniel tried to stop her. His words swung wildly between anger and pleading. "You'll ruin us both if you walk out that door," he warned. "You won't survive without me." But Olivia had already made her choice. For the first time, his threats felt hollow, powerless. She turned to him and said quietly, "I'd rather lose everything than keep living this lie." When she left the building, reporters were waiting. Cameras flashed, voices shouted questions, but Olivia kept her head high. She did not respond, nor did she hide her face. The woman who once played the silent wife was gone. In her place stood someone who had begun to reclaim her voice, one step at a time. She found refuge in a modest apartment across town, far from the glitter of Manhattan. It was small, with peeling paint and worn furniture, but it felt real. For the first time in years, she cooked her own meals, made her own schedule, and breathed without fear of appearances. The freedom was fragile, but intoxicating. Though the tabloids mocked her, Olivia began to notice small ripples of support. Strangers left notes at her door, thanking her for showing strength. Emails arrived from women who had lived in silence beside powerful men. She realized her story was not just hers. It belonged to countless others who had been voiceless. In the quiet of her new apartment, Olivia understood she was beginning again. She had lost her place in the glamorous world, but she had gained something far greater, herself. The first step away from Daniel was also the first step toward a life that was truly hers. It started with a single phone call. A journalist who had followed her story asked if Olivia would give an interview. At first, she hesitated. Speaking publicly meant reliving her shame, reopening wounds she had barely begun to heal. But then she remembered the notes from strangers, the voices of women who saw in her a reflection of themselves. She agreed. The interview was raw and honest. Olivia spoke about her years of silence, her sacrifices, and the humiliation of the gala. She did not attack Daniel directly, but spoke instead of the dangers of losing yourself to someone else's shadow. Her sincerity struck a chord. The article spread quickly, praised for its honesty and courage. For the first time, Olivia's voice was louder than Daniel's lies. Messages poured in after the interview aired. Women wrote of marriages built on silence, of dreams abandoned, of courage buried. Men wrote too, admitting they had never considered how much strength it took to walk away. Olivia read every message, her eyes filling with tears. She realized she had become something she never sought, a symbol of resilience. Daniel tried to discredit her, calling her bitter and ungrateful. But his words fell flat, drowned out by the chorus of voices supporting her. Olivia no longer needed to defend herself. The truth, spoken from the heart, carried more weight than any of his empty denials. For once, she felt free, not just from him, but from the silence that had bound her. Opportunities began to appear. Non-profit groups invited her to speak. Universities asked her to share her story, and women sought her guidance. Olivia realized that what had begun as her private battle had become a public movement. Her fall from the glamorous world had turned into her rise as a voice of integrity and strength. And just like Olivia, I want to hear your voice too. If this story has moved you, Share your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe courage can be born from shame? Your words matter here, and they can inspire others who might be living their own silent battles right now. Olivia's days no longer revolved around galas or charity luncheons. Instead, she poured her energy into causes that gave her life meaning. She volunteered at women's shelters, offering a listening ear to those who carried their own scars of humiliation. At first, she felt uncertain. After all, she was still learning to rebuild herself. But as she listened to their stories, she realized how deeply her own journey resonated. Her presence inspired others. Women looked at her and saw proof that even from the ruins of disgrace, strength could rise. They did not see the glamorous wife who once wore diamonds, but a woman who had walked through shame and chosen dignity. For Olivia, that was more powerful than any applause she had ever received in the glittering ballrooms of New York. She also returned to the business ideas she had abandoned years earlier. Sitting at her small kitchen table, she sketched plans for community programs and sustainable ventures. Her hands trembled with excitement as she remembered what it felt like to dream for herself, not for Daniel. The work was slow and modest, but it was hers, and that made all the difference. Media outlets continued to follow her story, but Olivia handled it differently now. She was no longer afraid of headlines or photographs. Each interview she gave was honest, free from the rehearsed smiles and empty phrases of her old life. She wanted her words to carry truth, not image. Slowly, the world stopped labeling her as the disgraced wife and began calling her the woman who refused silence. Olivia's evenings were no longer spent in empty penthouses, but in community halls filled with laughter and hope. The sparkle of chandeliers had been replaced by the glow of simple lights. Yet these rooms felt warmer, more alive than any gala she had attended. She began to rediscover not just her purpose, but herself. But as her new path blossomed, a shadow still lingered. Daniel was not gone. The scandal had only deepened, and soon the time would come when Olivia would face him one last time. Their confrontation would not be at a dinner party or behind closed doors, but in the cold, unforgiving walls of a courtroom. The day of the hearing arrived, and the courthouse buzzed with reporters eager to cover the fallen investor and his estranged wife. Olivia walked through the doors with quiet dignity, wearing no diamonds, no silk, only a simple suit that reflected her strength. Cameras flashed, but this time, she did not flinch. She was no longer Daniel's shadow. She was her own light. Daniel entered moments later, his once commanding presence diminished. His tailored suit looked less like armor and more like costume. He scanned the room, searching for the admiration he once received, but found only cold stares and skepticism. When his eyes met Olivia's, there was anger, but also desperation. He knew she had become more dangerous to him than any journalist. The lawyers presented evidence, each document stripping Daniel further of his defense. Fraud, deception, and betrayal unfolded before the court. Olivia sat quietly, listening. No longer a passive bystander, but a witness to the truth she had once been forced to ignore. For years, she had held silence in her chest, but today, silence was her power. When called to speak, Olivia's voice was steady. She told the court of the years she spent hiding behind appearances, the humiliation of the gala, and the moment she chose to walk away. She did not seek revenge. She sought only to show that truth could not be buried beneath wealth and lies. Her testimony was not fiery, but it carried a strength that silenced the entire room. Daniel attempted to interrupt, his voice filled with anger. "You owe me everything!" he shouted. But his words fell flat, echoing like the last cry of a man who had already lost. The judge silenced him. The evidence spoke louder, and Olivia's quiet courage outweighed his fury. As the session ended, Olivia stood and walked past him without a word. For the first time, she did not feel small beside him. The courtroom doors opened, cameras flashed, and Olivia stepped into the light not as the wife of Daniel Morgan, but as Olivia Morgan, the woman who had chosen truth over silence. The weeks after the trial brought a wave of change for Olivia. Articles no longer called her the disgraced wife, but instead the woman who stood for truth. Invitations returned, not to the glittering galas she once attended, but to conferences, community gatherings, and organizations eager to hear her story. For the first time in years, people wanted to hear Olivia, not Daniel's wife. Her first public appearance came at a small community center in Brooklyn. The room was filled with women from every walk of life: teachers, single mothers, immigrants, survivors of broken homes. They gathered not to admire her dress or jewels, but to hear her words. As Olivia walked to the podium, she felt her hands tremble, but the applause was warm and genuine. She began softly, speaking of the night that changed everything, of the humiliation that nearly destroyed her, and the shame that clung to her name. But then she spoke of courage, of the decision to walk away and the rebirth that followed. Her words carried honesty, not performance, and the women in the room leaned in, tears shining in their eyes. When she finished, the audience rose to their feet, applauding not just her story, but the strength they saw reflected in it. Olivia had never experienced such a moment, not in the grandest ballrooms nor under the brightest chandeliers. This applause was different. It was real, born of connection, not image. Afterward, women lined up to speak with her. Some hugged her, others whispered their own stories of silence and survival. Olivia listened to each one, realizing her voice had become a bridge for others to find their own. Her shame had transformed into something far greater: hope. As she left the center that night, Olivia looked up at the city lights. They no longer felt like reminders of a world that rejected her, but like stars guiding her forward. She had faced the storm, and now she had won her first victory, not in court, but in the hearts of those who believed in her. Months passed, and Olivia's story continued to spread. Universities invited her to speak, nonprofit groups sought her guidance, and journalists praised her as a voice of integrity. Each stage she stood on felt surreal, but with every speech she grew stronger. She was no longer defined by the scandal. She was defined by the strength she discovered within it. One evening, she was invited to speak at a prestigious ethics forum in Washington, D.C. Leaders, students, and professionals filled the hall. As Olivia walked to the microphone, she no longer felt the trembling that once haunted her. Instead, she carried herself with quiet confidence, her voice firm and steady as she began to share her story. She spoke of the dangers of silence, of the cost of pride, and of the freedom found in truth. She described how the world she thought she needed, wealth, status, and appearances, had crumbled, but from its ashes, she had discovered her real self. Her words painted images of loss, but also of renewal, reminding the audience that even humiliation can become the beginning of strength. The hall erupted in applause, louder than any cheer she had ever known. People stood, clapping not for glamour or reputation, but for courage. Olivia felt tears sting her eyes as she realized how far she had come, from the silent wife in the shadows to a woman standing proudly in the light. After the forum, reporters approached her, eager to capture her reflections. But Olivia no longer spoke for headlines. She spoke for the women who still lived in silence, for those who doubted their worth, and for anyone who needed proof that life after disgrace could still hold dignity and hope. Her rise was not a fairy tale, nor was it easy. It was forged in humiliation, loneliness, and struggle. But standing in that hall, hearing the applause, Olivia understood the truth. She had not been destroyed by scandal. She had been reborn. Olivia no longer lived in the shadow of chandeliers or marble halls. Her days were filled with quiet mornings, handwritten notes from people she had inspired, and evenings spent with communities that valued authenticity over appearance. The luxury she once clung to seemed distant, unnecessary. What mattered now was the peace she felt in living truthfully, without masks or pretense. She had rebuilt her life not with jewels or contracts, but with dignity. The woman who once walked silently at her husband's side now walked proudly on her own. Each speech, each story she shared, became a thread in a new tapestry, one woven not by shame, but by resilience. Olivia had discovered a wealth far greater than money, the strength of being unapologetically herself. Daniel, meanwhile, faded into obscurity. His name, once a symbol of power, became a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms and classrooms alike. He was remembered not for his empire, but for the arrogance that destroyed it. Olivia rarely thought of him now. His downfall was no longer her burden. Her story had outgrown his shadow. One evening, Olivia returned to the small community center where she had given her first speech. The same women gathered, their faces alight with hope. As she spoke, she realized the journey had come full circle. The humiliation that once broke her had transformed into the platform that lifted her higher than she ever imagined. When the applause ended, Olivia looked around the room with quiet gratitude. She was no longer defined by what she had lost, but by what she had found: courage, truth, and freedom. The scandal that once felt like the end had become her beginning. She was not the wife of Daniel Morgan anymore. She was Olivia Morgan, the woman who rose again. And as this story closes, I want to ask you, what did Olivia's journey make you feel? If her strength inspired you, subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters here, just like hers did, and it may be the spark of courage someone else needs to hear today.